All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us for this Sunday's special geopolitical masterclass. We've done several of these with my good friend Joaquin Flores already. I'm just periodically going to pause awkwardly to let people in because I can't do two things at the same time. All right, we've done a few of these presentations with Joaquin already in the past, and each one has been more mind-blowing than the one before that. I think everyone here, you're here because you have already recognized that Joaquin brings something very special to the geopolitical analysis table. I mean, there's a bit of a flood of information. Everybody's commentating and opinionating, on what the world is going through. And some opinions carry more weight than others. And the thing that I resonated with early on with Joaquin's analysis is that he's not just keeping a multifaceted approach on many different moving parts of the world system, but he has a sensitivity to historical forces, as well as the battle for the mind field, and the structure in which the mind moves from ignorance into potent or impotent concepts masquerading as truth. So potent ideas and impotent ideas themselves have their own structure of how they came into being. Very few people bring that epistemological sensitivity to their analysis. Joaquin does it very well, and because of that, he's able to recognize the sensitivity, or he's sensitive to the games within games, which is all of human history. Real politics is not anything you could really take from the standpoint of pure sense perception, just hearing what somebody says on the good or on the bad side of events in world history. If you just take what they say and leave it at that, and then build your analysis based on empirical words that you've heard, you will understand nothing. As Shakespeare said, the world is a stage, all of us are actors. And it's by understanding what are the good stories, what are the good actors, what are the good intentions and agendas behind the surface appearance of things, that we can better penetrate into the causes of our own current crises, but then also better chart out what would be viable pathways to a future worth living in, which is in accord with natural law, the destiny, the ultimate purpose of mankind. So there's a lot going on. I mean, it's been an explosive week. It's been explosive months. It's been an explosive year, or even 3 years. But the density of explosive events has definitely been increasing. We've got very interesting processes going on the issue of Prigozhin. We've got and very interesting anomalies that have occurred in Africa, as well as in Belarus, as well as on the front of Poland. A very confused area right now, which is being played in a very interesting way. And Joaquin, you've said some things more just, I think, today in your Telegram group, which is almost like an essay article you composed on the Rumsfeld plan, which I'd like you to go into. But there's so many different points. There's elements on the U.S. Trump indictment level, and the whole fight to use lawfare to undermine the upcoming elections. So, like usual, Joaquin is going to paint a picture. We're going to sit back, we're going to learn, take notes, whatever, and then I'm going to open up the door for Q&A. I'm sure this, like always, is going to have a very lively
I think
process.
the Q&A parts are the best. The Q&A parts are the best. Is my audio good?
Your audio is okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so I'd like to keep my presentation brief so that the questions dominate I'm good for like 2 hours, and I'd like to present in 45 minutes and have an hour and 15 minutes for questions that people can have whatever is raised or satisfied or whatever, right?
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And so for everybody, if you want to ask a question, put your little digital hand up, or put your name in the chat box. I'll call upon you. Or if you want me to read the question, just make it a short, concise question, and I'll do that. So Joaquin, it is all yours.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction, Matt. And yes, today I think one of the things that we encounter, and I know Matt and I have both written about it in the past, and Matt again recently, and reaffirming things that I think need to be established, just sort of how we encounter information and what are our underlying assumptions about it. And one of those has to do a lot with when you look at the question of multipolarity and globalization, and what's the difference between these two. And one of the things that has come up, I don't know if you would call it like a pseudo theory or a notion, or a convenient arrangement of facts with the expressed exclusion of other more meaningful facts, or facts as meaningful to include, through these various forms of error. And I think for many it's honest, but this is a very high stakes game. And so what I want to say is that the incentive to actually do intentional harm, or the incentive to deceive, is actually very high, from the point of view of maybe the CIA, or from certain Western military think tanks that make a lot of money or are involved in the shaping of ideas. And that main idea that I'm talking about, that's the really, I think, the one that is most meant to deceive when it's promoted by people who should know better, I guess, is that the emerging multipolarity is part of the globalist plan. And that can be connected to, for example, very much similar, I would actually say, to the idea that the primary thing happening in Ukraine is that the whole thing, the outcome, no matter what it is a globalist plan. Right. So in other words, I'm connecting two false ideas, right? That the entire war in Ukraine, whatever the outcome, is a globalist plan and desirable globalist outcome. And the idea that multipolarism and globalization are both the same thing, or backed by the same people, or towards the same, and to take your pick, it all really means the same thing. So I think that's the first thing that I would want it to, I don't know, develop. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. And the reason, like I said, is that this is something that has been, I think, as I say, when we approach problems, like, for example, when you look in the United States, you might find Democrats and Republicans obviously working on behind closed doors on the same agenda. And then you can see the fruits of that agreement. You can see, for example, all of the neocons that the Obama administration brought into all the important cabinet positions. I mean, the stuff that neocons like Kagan and Nuland were doing in Ukraine was on Obama's watch, as much or more than it was even when Bush was there, right, before Obama. So I think that people accurately can perceive also, for example, Labour and Tories in the UK play a very similar game. I know in Canada, you explain very similarly how the political system is rigged in such a way between, the two preferred parties, right? So we have a working model from which to understand the idea that Russia and the United States could be being managed in some way, the way that controlled paradigm fights like Democrats versus Republicans are often staged events. And I think that from the point of view of the system, one of the most interesting things about that, Matt, is that if hypothetically, and this is actually a hypothesis that I think is more worthwhile in the end, I think it pays off the most. But as a hypothesis, let's assume that that Russia and the United States are not working towards the same goal, right? Now, if you were the power brokers in the United States, it would certainly be disheartening and disempowering to people who were looking at the Russian project as something different, or an alternative, or distinct, or unique, or sovereign from the globalist project, right? And if these people, these globalists, let's call them, were, for lack of a better, more conventional term, we call them the corporatists, the technocrats, et cetera, right? There's many, the ruling class, what have you. But these globalists in the West would definitely like it to be the case. and it certainly buttresses their power projection. If more people in the world, let's say you're, in El Salvador, or in Cameroon, or in South Africa, and you're in government, right? And you're kind of trying to understand what's going on in the world. You're going to be hedging your bets and being very careful about your alliances and your commitments if you actually think that, well, actually, Putin has some secret agreement with, Kissinger or Brzezinski or whatever the story is, right? Or Rockefeller or Rothschild or whatever the story is. And that this is going to be the defining, how should I say, Matt, like the way that that's the end of the story. Then people are going to come away with profoundly uninformed, and like I said, potentially, like if you were a leader in the world, you would actually have like a distorted perspective of what's happening in geopolitics on the whole, right? So this is actually an issue of national security. These are wrong ideas that can lead to national security crises. These are wrong ideas that can lead towards all kinds of chaos all over the world. So also, part of these narratives are disempowering because, for example, they eliminate the role of agency in how plans are. They attempt to do things. They have studies, they have ideas, they have assurances, they have control over social media, they have polling, they have analytics from Google and Facebook. They have an idea where people's heads are at. And they also have an idea about the legal terrain, where elected representatives are at, what's the culture, what's the situation in the country. And then they try to roll out these whatever mandates or pseudo laws or whatever. And to the extent that people push back, and to the extent that people actually respond in a I don't know how you would characterize it, but at odds with what the system wants, right? It's certainly not antisocial. It's the system is actually promoting this antisocial agenda. So the degree to which people push back, then they push back. Will they try again later? Yes, of course, right? They will try again later, but it's an important test balloon it's like a mind canary for the ruling class to see. They're always trying to see how far can they push the agenda, and then people do push back, right? Now, people show that they can push back, right? And it's true that built into their plan, they have some way that they want to deal with people pushing back, right? Now, people obviously have to push until there's a degree of success, right? You obviously can't just push a little bit and then you're relaxed, right? People do tend to do that, however. They tend to think, okay, this little victory is won or whatever. But in this stage in the struggle where we are, it requires eternal vigilance. And there's some ideas about the role of citizens being eternally vigilant in whatever that goes far back hundreds of years in the founding of the United States. So this is not a new idea. The idea that we're going to have just a political solution and then citizens go back to ignoring politics is either dangerous or a myth, or it's very misinformed. Like, this is a perpetual project, right? And until kingdom come, or until there's some transformation in consciousness, or the technologies combine, what have you. But obviously, we're going to have this group in the West, in the ruling class, who, although their global power projection profile is decreasing with regard to, in economics and military, in any number of arenas, their power is decreasing. But within the United States, they're still going, or within the West, they're still going to try to hold on to power using various methods that have been described as dystopic or surveillance state, or things like, others have called it surveillance capitalism, things like this. So they would like very much for people to think that whatever happens is in their plan, because that increases their power profile and their ability to project. We talked about conceptual power, or information war, or soft power. All this, that, in other words, no matter what happens, this is in their plan. Okay. Now, there's an important distinction to make between their plan and contingencies and problem solving. And of course, one is not to deny their ability to back up and recalibrate or go for plan B or plan C or plan D. But to think that any one of those is the most preferable, or that they're all equal in the same, then they wouldn't have gone for plan A first if it wasn't require the least energy, the least risk, the biggest outcome, whatever. So in effect, so far, people's fight back is actually the world that you're living in right now. It's not the total dream of the agenda of the ruling class. They have an idea of what that looks like. They speak about it often, but there's some interesting things to consider. For example, a lot of these things with global governance around climate control, people, even though countries like India and China and Russia and Brazil on paper look like they're signed up to it, if you actually understand what's been going on for the past, I want to say 15 years, you'll find that those countries have rejected, especially India and China and Russia, have rejected a lot of these things about whether it's like carbon emissions and things that are connected, cap and trade schemes, things that were all based upon this idea that all the legitimate environmental concerns had now been replaced with this issue about global warming or climate change. So these countries actually, even though they use the language, the discursive framework of, I mean, even until a year ago, Lavrov would speak about the NATO and the United States as their partners. Like, we continue to work with our partners on these things. So I think that, well, this is not unique. This is actually very standard in the language of diplomacy. If you read the letters and in diplomacy and letters between diplomats in the 19th century, or among people, you will find there's always this tone of respect. There's always this collaborative tone, and these things will carry on. Sometimes things could get very nasty. Don't get me wrong. There were wars back then too, but the level of decorum and the language of inclusiveness and respect was there all along. And I think that in the West, because we got you, and I'm just surmising, this kind of this almost polymath, like tough talk from our presidents, from our leaders, talking about, we're going to show them, or, McCain singing Bomb Bomb Iran, or this a lot of this bravado and bluster that, as you could see, backfired, that this is not normal, right? The way that Lavrov, for example, was calling countries that they were aware were planning a war against them, but up until the last minute, they were calling them partners. But I'm just saying, this is an example of just the how diplomatic language exists, and institutions that flow out of the UN, right? Even though many of these institutions are under, you would call them regulatory control by these big transnational corporations, certain countries, for certain agenda. The World Economic Forum is totally piggyback many of their language, their phrases, straight from the United Nations. Right. In fact, many of these groups and breakaway and think tanks like the World Economic Forum have created the language system in the UN. So it's actually a battle over definitions, because here they're saying, well, here's the words to use. OK, and then China and Russia come along and say, well, can we use the words like this? Well, how about we just define it this way? So you're reading, oh, yeah, China is on board with climate control concerns. But when you actually look at their participation in things, and you could go back to any of these COP meetings. COP 26 was a catastrophe. They never get Chinese involved. These go back to COP
COP 14 even in 2009 was like
COP 14 2009. I think you wrote about recently. And you pointed out there that India and Russia told them no again, right?
India and China took the lead, but the Russians were also very loud, making the point that this is all based on fraudulent science and vast data sets that the Russian climatologists provided to the IPCC, which were all ignored in their climate models. So the Russians were very loud. But yeah, it was the Chinese and the Indians, with, I think, Sudan and some other African countries, who locked themselves in a room and didn't participate in anything. Yeah.
Yeah, that was phenomenal. And that was COP 19.
14.
It was 14. Yeah, COP26 was last year. Yeah, so then 2009, you said 2008.
2009 was COP
14.
14. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So they have okay. So the discursive framework. So Russia's taking the language. China does it too. Um, from this rules-based order language set. Okay, you have international law, you have rules-based order, but rules-based order seeks to be lawful, whereas international law is what's legal, and there's this kind of weird distinction between legal and lawful, and it looks like the this rules-based order system is attempting to kind of create facts on the ground and a series of things that are legal so that altogether the whole construct can be considered lawful, even though they couldn't actually say that there's some statute or code or some or agreement or between international law would be like treaties, for example, that actually makes it legal. They're just kind of interpreting a body of existing treaties and then extrapolating from this that there's some whole of it that's greater than the sum of its parts. You see what I'm saying? And of course that there's that principle that exists in science. Don't get me wrong, but they're making this kind of convenient look here but don't look here case about it and trying to build up this edifice called rules-based system or rules-based order. But Russia will use the language of the rules-based order, and China will use the language of the rules-based order, knowing that this language can be used in a way which is compatible with international law. Okay, so for example, I'll just put it like this way: with like making a relationship again to like with the lockdown or the mandates and things like that. Okay, all laws can be considered mandates or rules, but not all rules or mandates can be considered laws. So if I'm talking about things that are rules and mandates that are legal, I can use the language of the rules and the mandates or define them in a way that's well. Anyhow, I'll continue
Yeah.
on this, and then okay. So likewise with the war in Ukraine, the ruling class would, or the whatever you want to call them, would like you to think, would like you to imagine that I'm saying at a deeper level, not this like New York Times, Washington Post level. Okay, we're talking about in the arena of special intelligence operations in the 77th Brigade, the UK or whatever they're called, or the different troll farms that exist, and I guess you could put this in the black pill universe of things in general, and it is definitely a black pill trope, and it's just like we said with Ukraine, that even if the outcome is, 100% of what Russia, I don't know if there's, what they wanted. I know they haven't said, what that looks like, but whatever that outcome is, just hypothetically, imagine that it's whatever Russia was aiming to do. And there is an information campaign coming from these same globalists that's going to try to create the idea that they've also won in that outcome. Like in that outcome, their agenda has also won. And they'll point to, of course, the disastrous loss of human life being in connection with their population agenda. They'll point to the destruction of infrastructure and how things will have to be built back is like identical to the we talked about, like build back better. So these are the things that they're going to try to point to in the outcome in the Ukrainian war, which it looks like Russia's going to get most of what it's trying to accomplish there, and they're going to spin that as if this is all part of the globalist plan. So I think I've explained how that one works. Recently, I know there were questions, and I only have like 15 minutes more to present on those main ideas. In terms of multipolarity versus you would call it globalism or globalization. It's a very similar process. So what they're trying to do now, I'm talking about this very special operation of Black Pill, right? Is they're trying to say that BRICS was always a Western plan, that multipolarity is part of the scheme. They and this would relate back to the same idea that everything is a controlled paradigm fight. And then the only way that you can actually believe that is if you look at the words, I guess the language, the discursive framework that different leaders are using, or if they think that technologies inherently have certain implicit applications. So I guess there's like a technophobia involved. And then I guess the other main would be how on the balance, what you don't have is an accounting for in the process of development of what was called globalization. And I had a slide that Matt has, but he's not. I guess we have a issue.
I just got my connection back, so I could show the slide, actually.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, I was worried if we lost you. Yeah,
Yeah,
I have a slide here. Just
you
I'm
did,
going to use.
but I'm back.
Okay, this is just an example, just superficially from Latin America. This is the combined Latin American Caribbean economies going back to what's the starting decade there? Do you
1960.
see? Okay, all the way to present. Okay, and overall, you can see there's a lull in there. There's some drops, but overall, the trajectory is more exports internationally. Okay, so based on this kind of very simple, we could extrapolate. That's Latin America. You would find the same in South Asia. You would find the same in any developing part of Africa. You would see that over the decades that exports, that their interaction with the external world and their exports are going up. Okay, so if your definition of globalization is just that countries are exporting more and economically dependent on their exports, then that would be like the same thing as thinking that digital currencies are inherently tyrannical, or digital currencies are inherently exploitative, or digital currencies are inherently undermining the individual. So in other words, if you define the thing in the most, I guess in the least descriptive way possible, the simplest but not elegant, because you're missing definition, right? You're missing the substance of the meaning. You're vulgarizing something. It's a reduction to absurdity, right? That if countries are simply exporting more and more, that means that globalization is happening, right? And I'm just making that comparison to saying that thinking that digital currencies in and of themselves mean that the country is becoming tyrannical or the country is becoming like this, okay? Okay, so what this chart doesn't show is the degree of exports from a given Latin American country where the target destination was also in Latin America. This just shows that the exports of Latin American countries, and then you just assume that they're exporting out of the region altogether, and that is not the case. I don't have the slide that shows, for example, but anyone can look and see after a country's number one or number two trading partner, because of the volume sales and the way that, right, you look at who are the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, and you get regional, everything turns regional. Okay. Everything turns regional once you get past, in some countries, regional is at the top, but for many countries, they might have United States or Germany or China, or in very few India, but that's growing as the primary trade, right? But that is changing. But hidden in these types of simplified graphs have been an emerging multipolarity. The thing is that in looking at the same data sets, the simplified ones, you could arrive at either possibility. You wouldn't have a conclusion, but you could, both possibilities are still open based upon data sets like this. That's what's the most interesting thing. So, but what was actually happening is that the interdependence of a given country was increasing. But if you look at Malaysia, Indonesia, if you look at, let's say with relation to ASEAN countries, the volume of trading in between that block is growing exponentially in comparison to its ones that are very global supply line security reliant. The ones that are reliant on long naval supply lines, those still exist, right? But the growth areas are not in where you need to send a boat around the world to do it. The growth areas are in places that you have road and rail that connect these. And so I don't want to say naturally because humans are building all of these, but logically you can, or rationally you can see that if you're exporting something and time and transportation are costs, then the closest neighbor of trade in many ways is the easiest to get to, first of all. So that's actually your lowest hanging fruit, but countries actually had to build roads and infrastructure to do that. Put it to you another way is that up until the 19th and 20th centuries, coming off the history of colonialism from Western Europe, most of the developed cities in most of the so-called developing world were port cities. Now, what that means, however, is that if you step out of line, all they have to do is send the armada to your port, and then you surrender. Then you depose your king or depose your president and put someone that the people who own the navies want. And up until the second half of the 20th century, that was the British. Before and during, you had the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Dutch as well. Anyway, so this is the global system that we entered into. And so the thing is that if you actually understand who was behind globalization and why we started to think it was so natural, well, this is also the Washington Consensus. This is it's neoliberalism. And Washington Consensus neoliberalism is entirely driven by the interests of the IMF. Now, Matt, you've done a lot of work before on Bretton Woods and sort of like what was the original idea and what did we get, the difference between what the idea going in.
We lost Matthew again.
Okay.
He's having computer problems.
It's all good. Yeah. So anyhow, just that the IMF came with a certain agenda, and in the institutions of higher learning and academia and universities throughout the 1990s and 2000s, they were just teaching that globalization is natural, inevitable. It's almost like a force of gravity, that it's all part of, it's natural to capitalism. And all of those points that they make, of course, if you define the words their way, then it's true. But if you don't if you use the words that they use, but if you take control of the meaning, then you actually can use their language and say something very different. And the biggest difference that you can see between what was being sold and what was happening is that, there is a natural tendency in capitalism for capital to aggregate, for capital to collect, right? That capital is like also operates a little bit like a gravitational force, so to speak. So the assumption, I guess that, I mean, it was a convenient, I'm being generous when I say assumption. Obviously, I believe that they denied data and they were driven ideologically to arrive at certain conclusions. But among more honest people involved in it, or people who just assume that the other players had good data and were honest about it, the kind of the normal thinking without investigation, or the normal conclusion that I guess a person would draw would be like, look, New York, London, Berlin, to a certain extent, really maybe Amsterdam more so, Paris to a certain extent, are the traditional centers of capital accumulation. Paris with regard to so much of former colonial Africa. And so the thinking was that, well, this gravitational pull of capital will only continue, and there won't be any other kind of pulls of capital accumulation. So the idea of multipolarity, yeah, you can talk about the, different human dimensions other in our activity, which would necessarily involve the question of ethical, the question of moral, practical, the many, many questions, right? But simply objectively speaking, okay, one aspect of multipolarity is that you're seeing new centers of capital arise, right? So out of the historic centers of capital, then you have new centers of capital that arise. You're talking about, Rio de Janeiro, talking about Beijing, talking about Mexico City, Pretoria, Johannesburg, talking about there was so much potential with Libya, but that would have been, Tripoli would have been a big one, though, if it hadn't been for that war. But you get these developing centers of capital. Moscow is obviously important as well. New Delhi is important. I mean, these are huge centers of capital attraction that, like I said, I'm being generous when I say I guess the thinking was that the traditional centers of capital accumulation would simply just exist in perpetuity. But the thing is that even then, even 30, 40 years ago, it was evident that that the countries I'm talking about that have been growing, they actually gave them the name BRICS 10 years before, 12 years before BRICS called itself BRICS. They were just using the acronym to talk about what they consider to be the most growing economies in the world. So that really goes to my point about they're looking at data sets and they're seeing this happening, but they're trying to fit this into a globalization model, which is actually just kind of like some kind of unspoken, or they oftentimes speak about it in terms of the shared values and international community, and try to frame things in terms of ethics and values instead of just economic reality, as if they were ever the proponents of these ethics and values during this whole time, right? That's what's so weird about it. But same thing with climate and things like that. They try to make it like an ethical, like this is what's right, this is what's best, you see. And the reason for that is because it's almost like they're trying to recreate some type of cult or something like this, or like a religion gone wrong or something, because it's all about collecting the tithings. It's all about collecting the money and keeping themselves in some kind of authority over the developing world, even though that phrase developing world is specifically in that context of you could almost say there's no international law concept of developing country. It's actually a tacit or de facto recognition that some countries have more economic power than others, despite that in concepts of international law, countries are like more or less the same. So rules-based order tries to change things to make it to make the de facto and the de jure or the de jure line up. But the problem is they want it to line up to some perfect time in their history, in their timeline, like in 1997, when Yeltsin was both his most drunk, but also very much in power in Russia. And yeah, Russia couldn't really project much force around the world. They weren't able to intervene in a way in Iraq. They weren't able to intervene until the very end when Putin came into power at the end of the Yugoslav war in the summer of 1999. But that had been going on for, 7 or 8 years by that time, and Russia was not able to intervene. So yeah, it's true that if you think about what the collective West has been trying to pursue in terms of a rules-based order is to codify or to make solid something which they would claim is de jure, but in fact is neither de jure nor de facto, is neither of those two. I'm saying that, yeah, there was a window in the 90s and early 2000s where they could have, maybe, and I don't know how, but tried to make that more of a solid thing. They weren't able to. They just actually, the neocon think tank for what is it? The Project for New American Century. They were right when they actually said that the moment was over, and that acting now was even too late. And I think that assessment, if that's the assessment they made, it was either they said it's the moment is passing or the moment is over, but we need to do something now anyway. I think they were right in that sense. From a purely realist perspective, they could see that their ability to project that type of global power. I mean, they wanted to act like the destruction of the Soviet Union was very final, and that the West was very strong and everything. But in the Cold War, and that, yes. Are you back?
Hey, I'm so sorry. My internet is insane today. I've been kicked off a lot of times. So I just want you to know. So if something has to happen, will you feel yourself on your end if I can't get back?
Yeah, if something happens, I just want people's questions, but I hope you're able to stay on. But if I can get people's questions.
It's okay. I'll moderate, Matthew.
Oh. Okay, thank you. Over mind.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, that's basically my short presentation, just upon kind of comparing the concept of multipolarity to the concept of globalization, and how there's a black pill agenda that is being deployed by the globalists through the internet to make people to think, oh, here's the real goods, here's the real information, here's the real black pill. The truth is that that multipolarity leads to globalization. That's what they're basically, that multipolarity leads to one world government, or whatever the idea there is. So, but your question is going to be about any of our subjects that you guys might associate me with. We don't have to be strictly in globalization or multipolarity. But yeah, I'm good for questions now.
Okay, so the first question I have is from
Maloney.
Whoop.
Yeah, go for it. No, you're doing great. You're doing great. Yeah, lead it.
Okay, I'm introducing Helen Maloney. Will ask the first question, and then you will take over, Matthew.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess I'd like to hear your comment on what I had heard yesterday. So I was listening to Alex, I think from the Duran, and he was summarizing the African meeting in St. Petersburg, the African countries with Russia. And he said that, Putin said, look, if you need wheat, we'll give you wheat. If you need like free. And he said, if you need fertilizer, we'll give you fertilizer. And if you need money loaned to you, China's there, waiting in the wings to do that. So I guess what I'm saying is it sounds like they are trying to make the IMF, the banksters, et cetera, just like irrelevant, you don't need this organization anymore, because we can do what they can do. So you don't have to feel like you're under the thumb. And so my question is, did you hear that? And what do you think? Because it sounds great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I was also paying attention to Putin's the Africa-Russia summit, and a lot of the things that they were talking about, I think, are on a developmental level very important. And one of the things to keep in mind is that this is about opportunities and about competition. So it's the fact that the IMF has a challenger from other banks that are connected to different, ways of doing business. Just because what I'm trying to say is that just because the IMF was committed in its own most preferenced world to a certain global economic architecture, you could say this expression is popular to use. Um, well, it doesn't mean that in the world that actually is being made, that the IMF is necessarily excluded. Do you see what I'm saying? It just means that, well, see, now these African leaders have kind of in a way that was designed for our public, for the attention to be paid to it, because these communications happen all the time. But this is a very, I think, important media campaign and very important for, audiences that are paying attention, especially now with regard to the grain deal in Ukraine. That's what really the kind of the subtext of this is. But the information is not like novel information. It's simply a very good platform. It's like a very good way to tell the world, to remind them that there's options, that there's actually, that the IMF, if they're coming at you and they're saying, here, we're offering you this money and these are the conditions. Well, now you have an alternate system that can say, well, how does this deal work instead? And then countries can really decide, what, and so it's actually, it's not just good for countries that decide to have more investment or take loans from, let's say, BRICS, right? This is what effectively we're talking about when we talk about Russia and China and India. It's not the intention of it doesn't have to be anything other than just like the normal business of you're offering 4%. Well, we're offering 3%, right? We're offering to borrow money at 3%, they're offering at 4%, or they're offering at 5%, or whatever the thing is. So countries that remain with the IMF, however, may also benefit from this competition, because now the IMF might be looking at, well, they're worried about retaining customers. They're thinking in terms of, well, now there's another, burger shop in town. We better make sure that we use, right, whatever, right, tomatoes and fresh, right, lettuce and stuff like that. So just think in terms of competition between businesses that are doing that. So the other part about the Africa summit that is important, that I think that what the Russian side was trying to communicate is that, yes, Ukrainian grain and what happens with it is important, but Russia produces a lot more grain than Ukraine does. And there's a lot of things that can be done. In other words, there was actually a kind of a strange focus on Africa for the grain deal, because as soon as Russia talked about ending the grain deal, then we heard from the collective West and Zelensky and everyone else that Africa is going to suffer the most from this. But there was a whole scandal happening during the grain deal that the extra wheat that Ukraine had, it actually sold to Europe and then bought it back at 3 or 4 times the price as a way to launder money back to Europe that was given to Ukraine, and then the people involved, in the arranging, just whatever, taking from the top, whatever, their cream off the top. So yeah, it's a very good development, and this had been the Blinken's office had been on the phone very vigorously with most of the countries that you saw that turned out for this, that came, African countries. This is something that's been happening annually. This is not like a special emergency meeting. But they were under tremendous pressure not to attend this year in particular. And so the countries that you saw there were committed to not succumbing to Blinken's bizarre theories about what diplomacy entails. Yeah.
Thanks.
The next question we have is from Peter.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Ms. Flores. Question: what effect do the evidence schisms in Israel today have on the multipolar world development? Sub-question: what likelihood is there of use of what Seymour Hersh called the Samson option?
You're talking about, can you repeat the first question again for me? Just the first part?
Sure. What effect do the evident schisms in Israel have today on development of a multipolar world?
Well, you know, the process, like the process is going on in Israel with judicial reform and this fight around that. I'm not well read into how the fight over judicial reform relates to policies that, you know, that are in the country, if that's politics as normal or if that's representative of broader shifts. So I'm ignorant in the realm as to whether those particular where we're seeing people on the street and there seems to be a movement against Netanyahu and Netanyahu's moves to kind of contain or control outcomes in the judiciary. So I don't have good information on connecting that to the questions before Israel as a country in the region. You see what I'm saying? So because I know that just in general that in Israel for the middle class in that country, that the overall the amount the citizens pay contribution or pay in for basic services has increased, and the overall expectation, like Israelis of the generation like millennials, for example, like, and millennials turned 40 this year, right? Millennials turned 40 3 years ago, excuse me. So millennials turned 43 this year. Okay, so many millennials in Israel who are professionals or educated people in cities like Tel Aviv, for example, like their parents and their grandparents moved there for ideological reasons often. And now they're seeing that in terms of the quality of life and the size of their apartments and the hours and the taxes and things like that, like they're looking at other countries as places that might be desirable to move to. And so Israel, because people are online, people travel, Israelis have a great passport, they travel anywhere in the world, and they can kind of see that like that they're in a place where they're not very popular in their neighborhood. Those countries around them have grown economically, they've grown militarily. Israel cannot just rely on the US to come in and knock a few heads together and help them out to stabilize the situation there from their perspective, you see? So I think that they're having to, you know, I think that they're having to say, look, like our bottom line is we're a Jewish state, right? That's our bottom line. And everything else is, almost everything else around us is negotiable. And I think that for a long time, there's been different ideas, I know that there, you know, in the past 3 or 4 different leaderships in Israel, there have been very different ideas about how to approach the question of the occupation. Do you even call it an occupation, right? Is it something, are we building more settlements? Are we restricting them? Right? Right? So what are we going to do with the Palestinians? Are we going to keep them in these conditions where basically the strategy has been make it as uncomfortable as possible until they leave? Right? Is that the most viable way moving forward? I think these are all questions that you have a aging society in Israel. You're having problems with attracting more people to move there. The economics, well, maybe the economics in the areas where there's settlers, maybe you can afford to have kids. But if you're in Israel proper and you're living in a city, like it's very hard. It's very like you have to have two parents. It's very much like being in Paris or New York or something like this nowadays. It's like even the bad parts of town are expensive, right? So this is a problem that Israelis are facing. And in the politics is going to reflect those tendencies. But I have no idea about, who are the people protesting against judicial reform. Unfortunately, I just don't get in. I don't know enough about the internals today, in that society. But yes.
Yeah, that's definitely a topic which is full of Gordian knots and historic forces that make it not exactly as black and white as so many people who either hate Israel or love Netanyahu are trying to make it, and they try to reduce it to this overly simplistic formula of like the deep state is out to use the Supreme Court to keep technocratic controls in Israel against Netanyahu, who's fighting the deep state. Or Netanyahu is this absolute one-dimensional character representing pure evil out to have an authoritarian system to kill the Palestinians, and that's all he is. There's definitely a lot more, and this could be really unpacked in a much broader discussion.
I know, for example, that there's been settler groups that are very unhappy with Netanyahu because he had limited developments at times, and there's been lots of things that pushed back. You can Google Netanyahu limits settlements and things like this. There's been a lot of stuff over the years and arguments about that, but yes, it's also true that for his part, that Soros is very anti-Israel for whatever reason. He's just very anti-Israel. And I think that the idea that just interesting about Soros is that people are very quick to point out that he's Jewish, but what they don't want to, and they think that explains things because it's part of some broader, I would say, misinformed idea about how the world works and power in the world. But what they often don't focus on is his admission on television in back, some decades ago, that he was a participant in the Holocaust, that he helped Nazis identify people and seize their property. And then he was given the opportunity to apologize on live television at the time, and he said, "No, I would do it again. That was some of the best time in my life, and if it wasn't me, it would have been someone else." And so therefore, it wasn't me, he concludes, because even though it was me, if it wasn't me, someone else would have done it. So I'm just as culpable as no one.
Yeah, and that's where he says that it's a lot like speculating on currencies. Actually, if it wasn't me doing it, I hurt a lot of people, but somebody else would do it. So it's irrelevant that I'm doing it.
Would get hurt. So it doesn't matter that I'm the one doing. In fact, for me, it's better that I'm doing it. That's what he said, in fact, about his help with the Nazis. He said, well, if it wasn't me and being on this side meant that I wasn't on the other.
Yeah.
So I think that's a profoundly anti-Jewish George Soros. That's a profoundly Nazi George Soros. So it's a very, yeah. And I've also heard that Soros but I don't have a lot of solid information because it's not my area of expertise. I know a lot about the sides that were backing in the Syrian conflict. I know that like Israel was friendly with Qatar and friendly with Turkey and the US in the operation in Syria. They were providing some logistics and medical evacuations of important people from the FSA. And there was like video catching it on, video footage, drone or otherwise, of IDF going in and rescuing FSA people in the Syrian conflict. So yeah, but I mean people don't hate Turkey for that. People don't hate Qatar for that. People don't hate Saudi Arabia for that. It's just people, there's always like an extra meaning that people add into things that Israel does when they're being just as bad or good as other countries can behave in that region at times. But it's Israel was kind of like established in a weird way because part of the British establishment was against it forming, and another part of the British establishment was in favor of it. And but I think it would be hard to argue that Israel would have had the same level of prominence in the region if it didn't have the backing, at least eventually, or very thoroughly from the US and countries like this. So that's the geopolitical reality.
Mm-hmm.
Today, given that the US is not as powerful in the Mideast as it used to be, I've seen that Israel is looking for how to triangulate. They're looking for, well, they see that Russia is able to project power in Syria and in the region, and they see that Iran has a good relationship with Russia. And even though a lot of alternative media does promote the strong Iran-Russia relationship, they don't talk as much about things that our colleague Andrew Karipko has pointed out, which is that first of all, Israel is a nuclear power. They have 300 or 400 nukes. They can use those, and any country that's a nuclear power, you can't have a kind of wanton disregard for their existence, because that's the Samson option that Seymour Hersh was talking about, I think, unless he's talking about the Samson option with regard to the Ukraine conflict. I think that's a different question. But Samson option is something which is a term that surrounds Israel. And Samson option is one where Israel has no choice but to use nuclear weapons to defend itself. And I don't know that the present leadership would do that unless it was necessary. But I also know that Israel is looking at Russia as a balancer of Iranian and Israeli interests, as well as Saudi and Iranian. And whatever happens in Lebanon could tilt things, or, if there's a good outcome in Lebanon, then it could mean a change in policies for everyone in the region. And it's like, I think just broadly, if and I don't mean to simplify it, but if Israel could accept Iran as an Islamic republic, then Iran could accept Israel as a Jewish state, and they could just kind of call it even at that. But I think that Israel makes a kind of messaging error in presenting itself as a Western style democracy, but then it's also a Jewish state. You see, as an ethnicity or as religion, either way. I think that kind of presents a conflict with. It doesn't place it in the Western universe of how liberal democracy is promoted or conceived in the West, in the liberal West. But that doesn't mean that it's not a legitimate category. It's just something else and has to be examined for what it is. Yes.
All right. We've got a few people. So let's we have Joaquin for another 50 minutes approximately.
Yeah.
So let's try to hammer through these. We have we have two Jonathans. So let's go for Jonathan with the headphones, and then Jonathan the Caribbean will be second, then Bruce, then Monty.
Okay. I wanted to ask Joaquin what his thoughts were. I found that the Spanish election is pretty interesting because it's kind of highlights the fact that there's very likely going to be a breakup. Well, maybe not breakup, but a post-EU world in Europe probably looks not like the way the map would look today, and kind of what his thoughts are on a model for how Europe would unravel, because it's very likely like a country like Spain wouldn't keep together without the EU. So what his thoughts are on that?
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate the question. Well, even though this kind of Euroscepticism is a very important force, keep in mind that Greece, in a number of years ago, when they elected Tsipras, did so on some idea that if Tsipras got elected, that Greece would probably leave the EU, and they even in the platform of the coalition that they had, it was a left-wing coalition, however, they were promoting the creation of basically the translation was a BRICS bank, basically a de-dollarized deposit account, I think for BRICS use, yes. And people thought that this was a very big move, and then none of that, is what we saw. Now, in terms of a model, in terms of the Spanish election, leading up to the election, you had everyone in the, I guess you would call it the legacy media, warning that Spain's democracy must be protected from its voters, who were threatening to elect the most right-wing government since Franco. And this type of language has been abused so much now. It's a way of looking at politics that erases all the meaning, and then everything is far right. The right-wing coalition in Spain presents nothing like the history of Franco or the Spanish Civil War. So I thought it was a very disingenuous approach in media. The outcome of the election, however, I think is very interesting in looking at how Europe could be, what process. First of all, there's a difference between the concept of something and its expression in the world by which forces and who's behind it and towards what end. But the thing in and of itself, there's always, what I want to say, and I guess I'm just cautious, is that it's like there's always not always, how should I say this? Typically, the best approach is to take something which exists and try to look at what are the things that can be removed about it while salvaging what's good about it, or looking at the alternative. Like, typically speaking, if you just think about the world, really all of these different countries of Europe independently on their own wouldn't have the economic or other clout to make good deals with other major poles of capital in the world. Maybe the French and the Germans would do all right, but all these other countries wouldn't do nearly as good. And in many ways, and it's very strange, however, but in some ways, the EU is not enough of a country, and in other ways, in all the wrong ways, it's too much of a country. So in terms of the way that the whole thing has been, the whole game has been played, is that there's the US influence on the EU, and then there's the German and the French influence on the EU, if you can keep the French and the Germans on the same side. If you can keep the French and the Germans on the same side, the fight is happening in Brussels. But what's interesting is that some of the Eurosceptical movement, some of the Euroscepticism movements, right, are not just anti-NATO and anti-EU in principle. They're against German power in the EU. But the thing is that there's only two real centers of power in the EU in the fight in Brussels, and one of those is the US. So there's, and I'm not saying that countries should prefer to be ruled by the Germans as opposed to the Americans, but the structure of Brussels is such that whenever you hear or read analysis from a perspective of Germans that are pro-German Germans, not the anti-German party of Germany, but actually pro-German Germans, you'll find that their criticisms of the EU are not exactly the same as every every Eurosceptic movement criticism of the EU. Like Hungarian Euroscepticism kind of goes in the direction of Russia. Italian Euroscepticism for a long time was going in the direction of Russia. But other Euroscepticisms, for example, Euroscepticism in the UK or like the Brexit movement, while I think that's totally fine, and I think there's good reasons why a lot of people in the UK, I was happy to see people mobilize against something that the mainstream media was in fact supporting. I understand there's always fail-safes and second agendas or contingency plans that always can confuse our impression of what we're actually seeing. But on the whole, separate from the legitimate reasons that people wanted the UK out of the EU, the US also, if really understanding, the development of the relationship, also kind of enjoys that. They also kind of support that. I think that Obama at the time was forced to speak out against it. And I think that to some extent that is accurately the formal policy. And even though we kind of associate more like Nigel Farage with Brexit and Nigel Farage with being someone who likes Trump very much, that is part of the story. But even though the US, through Obama as a mouthpiece, seemed to be against Brexit, I don't think you really had the mobilized support in the UK to really make sure that Brexit would fail that way at the polls. And so the point is that there's different Euroscepticism. Sometimes Euroscepticism is actually, the point is that there's anti-US Euroscepticism in the EU and there's anti-German Euroscepticism in the EU. And both of them make it sound like you would just think that Brussels is the problem, when Brussels is kind of like the fight, is like the place where this fight is happening in the EU. And I think that interestingly, the US interference in the EU has at times privileged or propped up some countries' profile in the EU more than the Germans would have liked, in ways that are not bad in that contingent moment, in that place and time. Like you can totally see what's going on. But broadly speaking, if the US were to disentangle from the EU, and if the actual European Parliament, Brussels, actually was representative and it was sovereign in the sense that it was not external to Europe, what was going on inside, the intrigues and whatnot, which I know is a tall order, but you're talking about what solutions look like. Then I could see that the Germans out of self, in other words, first of all, they couldn't accomplish removing the US if there wasn't a very strong French and German alliance. If the US can keep French and German interests divided, then they can control the EU. They will keep the EU together so long as it works in the way that they want it to work. There's so many things that appear like one way that can go the other way. Like, for example, the development of an EU army could be allowed by the US, but then it's like, well, what's there between that and NATO? And it's basically, well, in a way, the EU army's been growing through NATO, and really just the end of NATO is just to remove the American commanders from NATO, and you're left with an EU army, right? So there's all these different ways of thinking about the EU, and but the main slogan of Europe of 100 banners, the idea that the European Union flag should be the primary national flag that's flown in every country is only like one vision of a stronger European Union. You could actually have simultaneously like strengthened sovereignty within the union and a stronger union when it comes to other things. So the concept of what I'm saying is that the concept of Europe as a whole, or the reality of Europe as a whole, is not different from the concept of Latin America as a whole. I don't think anyone's proposing that all the countries of Latin America just cease to exist and merge into some super state, but certainly as a bloc and the relationship between regions or countries within a bloc and the politics of the bloc itself are fairly well understood in terms of, regional versus federal, for example, politics within a country. So just extrapolate that regional versus federal kind of dichotomy and extrapolate that onto the entire territory of continental or peninsular Europe, if you will. So, I don't see the EU as a concept as being a problem. I see the way that it's being used, and actually the way that it's in kind of a flux, or the way that it's actually not very well defined, or the way that it has been defined too well in the wrong way, maybe is the more appropriate way. The values that it is using, it's trying to impose things that shouldn't be imposed at that level. The idea that what holds Europe together are very specific modern liberal values is ignoring the fact that actually there's a lot of history and a lot of shared history and a lot of and contributions that are shared and recognized that go back, hundreds and hundreds of years, you see. And so to make what keeps Europe, to identify Europe with late modernity, what is about as appropriate as if you actually just were to invent some country somewhere, anywhere, and just populate it with a random collection of people populated from Facebook or Instagram. And then, then in that case, of course, you would need to, what would be people's shared values, or what would be their shared experiences? Well, it would be all of the things in modernity or late modernity. Would it be all the things in social media? It would be all the things that you might call, cultural new leftism or something like this. That would be appropriate, probably the only thing that could hold those people together. But here you actually have Europe, which goes back, hundreds and thousands of years, the different stages in history, different conflicts. But to the extent that certain conflicts or tensions are focused as an educational thing, and the amount of how much we prioritize or weight that is entirely a social construct that can change from generation to generation depending on what's actually just in the lesson plan, right? What's in the syllabus. And those things, like in Ukraine, for example, there's nothing inherently anti-Russian in the history. You can have some ideological movement take power, and then they can show like, oh, in 1600 and something, we had this fight with the Russians, and then in 1800 and this, we had this fight, and then in 2000, it's like, okay, but you're looking at centuries of peace, and you're finding moments of conflict, and you're defining the relationship on those moments of conflict instead of the centuries of peace. So, and that's the kind of the way that European history could be dealt with too. Like, you don't have to focus on, World War I or the 100 Years' War doesn't have to characterize relationships of states in Europe, right? It's just a very superficial way. It's only convenient the other way. So, that's my best approach to Europe, though. It's a very good question. It's like you have the issue of these banks, the predatory banks. You have a very poor monetary system, a very stupid theory about what money is. They have a disastrous plan for the fourth industrial revolution. Like, fourth industrial revolution is a thing. I had written a couple years ago, whose fourth industrial revolution, ours or theirs? They try to, it's important that we win the battle of language, fight them on their terrain. They want you to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because then they're able to sell their lies with a bunch of actually aspects of truth, aspects of things that could work, things that should work, things like that. You're just giving them the monopoly on truth. You're giving them monopoly on language. You're giving them the monopoly on a vision for the future, if in fact you don't fight them on the terrain of their language. Getting around, like, once, because a population, people who are already informed or misinformed, are using this language. So if you don't approach them using this language, then they're going to think that you're actually the person under the rock, you see, and you're the one that's going to seem uninformed to them. But if you speak to them in the language that they've been hearing, then it's going to be like, oh, okay, this is a person who, oh, this is not an angle of it that I was aware of, but yeah, I'm unaware of what these words are, right? So it's a very important thing. And for that, I would say like the European Union, is a brand, and that brand can improve. It can get worse. Things can change in Brussels. There are some real, I just want to say, problematic underlying things built into the economic and social architecture of the European Union. Do not get me wrong. Do not misunderstand what I'm saying. It is catastrophic. Do not misunderstand what I'm saying. What I am saying is that in these models, in these things, there's an alternate vision, there's an alternate possibility. Because if you were to, just as a thought experiment, if you were to destroy the European Union, dissolve it, just dissolve the European Union, just blow up the building in Brussels, rip up every single piece of paper and treaty that made the European Union what it is going back to the 1950s, okay, and just start over. The natural thing to happen would be for these countries to first create a free trade zone or a deregulatory agreement to merge certain things in the areas of certain services, to make transport between things in the country, between countries easier, to create maybe something like a common economic union or something like that. And then maybe a few decades later, introduce like a single currency so that you didn't have people playing, a game, or you could have separate currencies, but have a fixed exchange rate, or you could have a single currency in your country, in your zone, the European Union, within a universe of floating exchange rates, less preferable, but we're just talking, development and stages and possibilities along the way as they emerge. So if you just did a thought experiment about eliminating the EU, and then what would be the natural kind of gravitational behaviors of the different European states, overall, you'd get another European Union, right? So since you can see that then that's why my approach is, well, what are the things with this European Union that could be done differently, right? Even though I'm fully aware of these inherent structural issues. So that's my best answer for you. Yes.
Yeah, I guess
great question.
Another way that I tend to think about it is, you could do greater good when you coordinate in your action amongst many players and participants, right? And harmonize action. You could do much greater good than if you were all individual and broken down, compartmentalized. But you could also do greater damage too. And so it comes down to the value question of, well, what is your moral compass? What type of actions are you committed to for what purpose, and what ideas of a just healthy society do you have? Because if it's like an oligarchical set of value structures, then your idea of what a healthy normal society would be a society which has got a bunch of dumbed down slaves fighting each other under total obedience and stasis otherwise to a master class. But if your idea is like the founding fathers and Benjamin Franklin,
that's right.
That's a regionalization of many compartmentalized units, colonies that recognize they could only fight and defend themselves if they work together. And then your idea is, well, we could do it. We could better uplift our quality of life and our way of thinking and being and have prosperity by coordinating our action under a regionalization. So it's like that for whether it's Africa or Europe but yeah, the way you said it was great.
Yeah. And it's like, technologies don't kill people. People kill people.
Right. That's it. That's key. People forget that. So we got 4 questions, 30 minutes. Let's make it happen. So we got Jonathan, then Bruce, then Monty, then we'll squeeze in Kelly, God willing. Jonathan Mohan, go for it.
Right, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Joaquin.
It's good to see you, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Joaquin. My question is based on what you just spoke of, put it into the EU, but I go into to Europe now as all these different nation states. The present deindustrialization of Europe, how does that fit into multipolarity? Because is it going to end up, are we foreseeing that forces within the US, London, so forth, prefer Europe to be in their pole of multipolarity, eventual multipolarity, or under their pole of control? Or is there more to it that Europe needs to be weakened so it would depend on the US for defense, etc.? Or are we looking at some sort of Halford Mackinder heartland theory where the world island cannot be reunited as one?
Very
What
good
is our thought
question.
sense there?
Yeah, look, so there's one vision of Western Europe where it's a part of a greater Eurasian Union bloc, right? Then really the Atlantic Ocean itself is the natural physical boundary, and North America would, if you look geographically and supply lines and transportation. Your question is multifaceted. It's very good, Jonathan. There are some things to keep in mind conceptually. So travel by land is actually much faster than travel by sea at this time. 300 to 400 years ago, when we're living in a system, even though we go on our smartphones, even though you can go online, even though all these things that are just, in a sense, kind of gadgets, but they've revolutionized communication. They revolutionized trade. They revolutionized the way that we interact with the world and the speed of business and information. Yet, despite all these trappings and despite that very modern weapons and laser guided this and hypersonic that and drones are used in the warfare, the economic foundation of the world that we live in was created 400 years ago, and at a time when I see you have many boats there, you have a beautiful boat behind you. These galleons and these large ships were actually the only game in town, and the entire system that we still live in is based on this model. And things like railroad and automobiles didn't exist in the way we would think about them today until around the turn of the century, 2 centuries ago. Trains a little bit longer, but the steam engine and the internal combustion engine all come within the similar 50-year period. And after this, that whole thing was never really developed. Like you have in the United States, yes, but it took up until, was it Eisenhower, right? With the freeway system and things like that. I guess there was works and roads done with Roosevelt as well. We have a train system, but if you look at the United States and its critical infrastructure and roads and rail, this is actually one thing it has not invested in many, many decades, and it's falling apart. Okay, so, but a boat can travel, a normal speed for a boat is 4 times faster than a person walking. And people think that, well, can't horses go fast? Well, yes, for like the Pony Express, you can have different fresh horses just a few miles apart and have one rider go a long way racing horses. But unless you have many fresh horses, if you're pulling a cart with horses and those horses are your horses and that's it, you're moving at walking speed. So horses were not fast, they were walking speed, and boats were 4 times faster. So you can see why boats was the big game in town. But the entire system, banking and the system of sanctions, which is really a blockade, okay, is based in boats. And roads and rail are actually from the beginning of the 20th century in the most, or middle, late 19th century. And we're only barely now, 250 years later, implementing system global economic architecture based on roads and rail. So we kind of pretending that information is the economic model. You can't eat information. Yeah, I can't put information, I can't pull up I don't put on my information in the morning when I get up and go to work. Yeah, I don't get in my information to take me to work. You see what I mean? So there's all these physical things in the physical economy. This is the next part of your question. So Europe, like the US, exported many of its manufacturing needs on this model of globalization and saying, well, we're going to keep these countries militarily weak and economically interdependent with us. If they got out of line, then we send the Navy to blockade their port. And if their port is blockaded, then they can't trade with anybody. Now, imagine a country if only a quarter of its trade was external to the continent. If you go blockade its ports, well, the most damage is just going to be whatever, a quarter, let's say. Just, I know it's not exact, but you get the idea. It's mostly dependent on the land. And you have hundreds of roads, dozens of rail lines. It's very hard to actually blockade one country next to another when they're all part of a system of roads and rail. Yeah. So this infrastructure is being developed now, but see, Europe could either go like three directions, and maybe it'll get split in the middle again, but it can end up as part of the Eurasian economy. The best way for that would be for the French and the Germans to be in the driver's seat of that process, along with Russia in the driver's seat. But it would need to be an equal partnership of Paris, Berlin, Moscow axis. That would be the ideal Eurasian integration model. Okay, if Europe is going to be a standalone entity in the shape more or less that it has now, okay, then it needs to move to fourth industrial revolution. But that's not based upon the World Economic Forum. That's not based upon austerity, lowering the human life expectancy, making apartments smaller. See, they want people to be shorter in life, smaller in living space, eating less calories or more bugs or whatever. Okay, this is a particularly dystopic vision, but it's the logical vision if there's no will, if there's no political will, if there's no vision, if there's no traction for bringing Industry 4.0 into Europe. See, this is only this is viable if you can keep Africa in third world, if you can keep South Asia from developing further, if you can keep Latin America from developing further, then you can situate a dichotomy between impoverished producing economies and wealthy service economies that people just live, however, in lower conditions to preserve the relationship. It's a very strange proposal. So yeah, so Europe has that choice. It can join up with Moscow, or it might get split down where France is with England and the US and Germany is with Moscow. It can go like that too. But I don't think that Germany would get split up again. And but for Europe to be a European Union but healthier, it would need to move into, it would have to do two things. It would need to build new production facilities in Europe based upon next generation, latest generation, which means, for example, I'll give you an example of difference between last generation and next generation, okay? In 5 or 6 years ago in China, I don't remember the automobile company, but they had 5,000 employees. Okay, they then brought in, in the same assembly line, they brought in they refurbished the entire plant. It has the same number of cars it produces every year, but now it's only 500 employees, and the rest are machines, are robots, so to speak. Not robots like a anthropomorphic robot, but big robot arms and many robotic things that in the old version it didn't have. Okay, there are even newer things that, for example, this factory in China was refurbished. Now it's 500 employees to make the same number of cars before as 5,000. That was done 5 or 10 years ago. It's not worth it for them to do it because they've just invested in something that was then latest generation 10 years ago. But Europe hasn't done this in ages. The United States hasn't done this in ages. So it would be perfect time for them to invest in what's latest now, because they don't have anything that they're paying off, that they're not trying to amortize any investment into the last thing, because they haven't invested into anything in decades and decades, maybe 50 years or 40 years. So they're actually, they have all the best incentives to totally turn this around in Europe, in the United States. They could totally make new industries where you would have what the Chinese had 5,000 people doing, now they have 500 people doing. A new factory could do the same thing with 300 people or 200 people. It's not as dramatic as the last update. It's been less time, but it would put you right on that ground. You'd hit the ground running. Okay. Now, the second thing that they could do, that they have to do, is if you're talking about the real limits to growth, the real waste and the real ecological crisis isn't being caused by humans farting or cows farting or too much heat, but the issue is that we're making the same thing too many times, planned obsolescence. So things are made to break, and that's the logic of this type of capitalist system. That whenever they talk about incentive, to use market incentives within capitalism to alter what is incentivized as a product, they're using concepts like cap and trade, like carbon credits, like everything is heat-based, right? And I'm not suggesting this is long-term solution, but you can get some traction and you can kickstart some industries at a certain stage before too much of the distorting effects on the market take hold. But you can have program for 5 years, 10 years, where you subsidize or you focus on things. Then you back off and don't let too many market distortions, right? But the main thing would be for incentivize products that last. Instead of incentivizing that less cows farted to make the thing, you want the thing to last longer. You see, why are you worried about reducing carbon emissions by 15% of something that you're going to buy 10 times in your life because it breaks every 2 years? That's retarded. That's stupid. It was already proven that they're using parts on purpose so they know when it's going to break. And it's not even using cheaper parts. So Vance Packard proved this in the book The Waste Makers back in the 1950s or 60s. So this is not new. This is not like a new information, crypto secret. This is a very well established problem. This is the main problem. And the fact that we're talking about temperature and climate change is like the definition of insanity when there's like this 800-pound gorilla in the room called planned obsolescence. So it's evident these people are not concerned about the environment. They're fakers. This is all designed. It's very misanthropic. It's about control paradigms and putting people into matrices and making so that you're taxed and monitored and tariffed for every microaggression that you make against the ecology in your lifetime. And this is all about controlling individual human behavior. It's all about eliminating the freedom of basic choice. I know it seems like a weird thing, but planned obsolescence is like the main event. It's like, well, take that idea. So a goal to reduce carbon emissions for a certain product by a certain year by 15%, but they're making the thing so it breaks 10 times, right? So if you only have to buy one of those things, right, that's already what, 90% less emissions altogether, right? Another way to put that, another way to think about that is that you could eliminate planned obsolescence and you could double the human population and still reduce the waste by 70% or something like that. Like, it's crazy when you understand the numbers and how much waste comes from planned obsolescence. The focus on human population size, like, we're all supposed to be adjusting and changing our culture and our life, and smaller apartments and lower ceilings and longer work hours, but work from home, but don't eat meat, but do eat bugs, but do this, but don't do that. And all of these things are like all about you control you. Everything is punching down. Everything is you're the problem. And yet, even though you're not sacrosanct, you're not inviolable, you're rights, your property are up for negotiation, the idea that companies are going to make less money because they're going to sell less of the same thing to you is totally off limits. That's the definition of crazy. So that's really where that's the second thing that Europe or any place needs to do. But Europe, you're talking about as a place and its recovery. My approach, Jonathan, and thank you for the question, man, has been that this whole conflict in Ukraine is actually aimed at Europe. That the real thinkers in the United States strategically, the Pentagon knows, look, the Pentagon was against Hillary Clinton starting the same war with Russia back in 2016. And they had a better chance then at maybe a conventional outcome that Russia wouldn't like, but then Russia still has nukes, so the whole thing is crazy, which is why the Pentagon probably didn't allow it back then either. And today it's even worse. Today, the Pentagon, they have an even clearer picture that Russia cannot be defeated on the battlefield. And maybe there's a chance that you can shake things up. It's a Hail Mary or extra super huge extra bonus if you can get regime change in Russia. But then is that guy going to be worse or better than Putin, right? Then there's that factor too. But if you actually look at what they can control, they're controlling how much economic damage is happening to Europe, right? So Europe is at its lowest point of sovereignty during and after World War II. And the US comes in, they don't regain their sovereignty after Hitler is gone and go, yay, right? Now they're under American sovereignty. And you had the Marshall Plan, you had all this capital rebuilding Europe. Okay, so the US through transatlantic banking institutions and militarily through NATO have maintained control over Europe on the whole, but organically, and this is reflective of human processes, okay? Organically, from the ground up, from the grassroots, enterprises and business and civil society in Europe grow and have different expressions of sovereignty. They have different expressions of a organic, natural sovereignty that, because human activity is always localized by definition. We exist orthogonal, in orthogonality. I mean, that is what existence is. So here we are. And so where you produce things, where you exist is where the wealth first happens. Same as in Europe. And sovereignty and power all rise up from the grassroots. Okay, so even though the United States has formal military and financial control over the broad architecture of Europe, bubbling up for many decades is increasing amounts of economic power, which, yes, the US can control through regulation of money supply and can control through, a captive audience for weapons sales and through other mechanisms. But you see, there's a lot of Europe now that's actually European. And this is like ripe for the harvest. They don't have their own military. They don't have their own monetary system. The European Union can only emit new euros in relationship to things like treasury bonds and the value of the dollar. It's all very connected. It doesn't exist independently of the dollar, in truth, in the final analysis, the euro. It does not exist fully independently of the dollar the way that, let's say, other currencies could in the not too distant future. So I think that's a very good number of questions, Jonathan. I hope that I leave anything out.
Oh, thank you very much, Joaquin. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. So who did I say we have next? Was it Bruce and then Monty? I think that was the ordering, right? Yeah, Bruce, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. Joaquin, I'm going to try to ask a bunch of quick questions and use a fair amount of time. First, where's the best place people can follow you, please?
On Telegram.
On Telegram.
New Resistance on Telegram. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that. It's a good
Do
time
you
to
have-
plug
And we're going to have that link in the description
Yeah.
box of this video when
I
it's
think it
online,
is.
so people
Yeah.
can follow your Telegram channel.
Do you have a secondary one not on Telegram?
I have an Instagram that I'm not really, working on, but I've got videos and material on there. Instagram. my name spelled similarly or same. I was kicked off of Facebook and Instagram before, so I changed my name to get around algorithm. But you
All
can
right.
spell my name. You can find it either with a J or an X.
Thank you. One of your great points was certainly for people to study things for themselves. You warned about the trap of assuming that the globalists are behind everything because they like everyone to think that, so that we are just cowed by their enormity and the hopelessness of mounting any kind of a defense. As an American, I'm well aware of a depopulation, deindustrialization, horrific agendas against me and my fellow Americans, and I believe this is happening in many, many nations. And your thoughts about you picking up the tool, if not the weapon, of national sovereignty as the best, if it's not the best, what might be, Joaquin, to flourish as humanity with inalienable rights, so we could have a government that has its just laws by the consent of the governed. And finally, what are you aware of James Roguski and his warnings about what the World Health Organization intends to lasso us with and tighten and strangle us with over the next few months, and the deadlines that are looming? And I'll implore everyone to write down or look in the chat for the link called stoptheglobalagenda.com, which is by James Roguski, warning about these looming threats from the World Health Organization. Thank you, Joaquin.
Thank you. No, I wasn't aware. I'm aware, very in general about the World Health Organization and what it's been up to, recently, and the things that they are continuing to push in terms of agreements, basically treaties, so to speak, that empower the World Health Organization to shortcut or the things that because they will say, despite what we saw, and although there was pushback, the World Health Organization is only looking at the pushback as the problem. So they're looking at what happened in certain countries that there was delay or consternation or pushback, and how can we subvert that or preempt that or get around that, right? So I know the World Health Organization is pushing up on a very big campaign right now. Is that with regard to what you're talking about? Is that the...
Well, that was the last point. I was happy to hear what you had to say about the four or five things they threw at you. Yeah.
Right. No, I know. I got that. I just wanted to touch on that because I had the least information about that. I would say that indeed that in the reality that we live in, that the nation state, and it's imperfect and it means different things, I understand, to different places and to different people. Some people see it as just the result of short near history imposed on them. That is often the case in parts of post-colonial Africa. You can look at the division of the Levant in the Middle East and say, well, these are arbitrary borders. So there's that understanding that there's some arbitrariness to borders, that in other words, here we are, right? And where did these come from? It's not always, a glorific story. Sometimes it's just the happenstance of history and the outcome of divisions, and where whatever you have the line between France and Germany, right? So this could have been a little over this way or a little over that way, right? And things would kind of look the same in the world today, wouldn't they? So, but the thing that's very interesting about this is that there's actually a moral and ethical component about this, as you as an individual in the world. So it's not just that the nation state, with all of its imperfections, is the best platform that we have today versus globalization. There's actually a moral and ethical component about who is each individual that's hearing this, who are they in relationship to those other countries? What do I mean by that is that, well, if you're in the United States, you're an American citizen. If you're in France, you're a French citizen. The actions that you make and the legal boundaries of that and your entitlement to behave is actually limited by that nation state. So it's very interesting because there's this human rights imperialism that comes from some circles that's actually very neoliberal agenda, Washington consensus, but it's this idea, it's connected to rules-based order, but it's this idea, of course, we know that there's universal human rights, but there's this idea that their interpretation of it and that this gives them a global enforcement mechanism to be like a global police, right? That many people around the world look at when let's say the US government tries to do, or the military tries to do nation building or state building in some other country after they destroyed it. What's interesting is that many critics of imperialism also kind of take on their own little miniature imperialist agenda by saying like, well, this is how places should act, or this is what should happen over there, or, well, I'm totally against the way they treat women, or I'm totally against the way they should change this, but just in the way that I think, you see? And even though that's well-intentioned, and maybe there's people in that country who would agree with them, and often there are, don't get me wrong, the idea that we are limited in what we can prescribe for, like, where do you have most information about? Probably in the language that you read. Like, what do you know most about? Probably what your neighbors are up to. Like, what's the biggest issue? Probably the one confronting your kids right now in the school. Or what's the biggest issue in your life is probably things that are actually more local in nature. And you have both the most information about it, you have the most skin in game, and you have a dog in that race. And it's kind of the farther in the world that you look, it's kind of like the more abstract your interest is. And it's also far more likely to get it wrong. It's like far more likely to get like some weird version of the story than as if you had lived there as you know? So we're actually constrained. We're not just instructed. It's not something that just empowers us. It actually constrains us. So citizens that run around like prescribing solutions for other countries are kind of being like miniature versions of their own government. And even though we can see how wrong it is when governments do it, we kind of have to like examine our own culture. You know, it's very different from just looking at what's happening. I consider myself a cheerleader. I look at the developments happening in the world, and when governments and countries look like they're doing something interesting or good for them, I'm like, good for them, you see. I don't get into too much, well, they should do this more or that more. It's like, who the am I? You see what I'm saying? Like, I'm kind of just becoming a miniature version of my own State Department from my own country when I do that. So I absolutely think that's a very good point that you raised. The nation state is the platform, and you had 2 or 3 others. Oh, well, what was my name, where to find me? Yes, that was one. And then alternates. I think that was the main of the thing. Yeah,
it was, and you responded to what I suggested about the WHO and the threats that they are.
Yeah, but could you tell us about the guy? What he's? I know you're going to share the link, but
yeah, his name is James Roguski, Roguski, and you can find his Substack. Anyone could just go to stoptheglobalagenda.com. It goes to a great recent article on his Substack where he equips Americans, Canadians, United Kingdom citizens, Canada, New Zealand, with links of how to send a letter of protest. That's there on the page, so you can read, this is what I'm going to send them. And it's for these really cogent reasons, the threats to national sovereignty and the provisions that are a noose around our neck, and the abrogation of national sovereignty, and also links to learn about what these proposals are. You could print it out, and he urges people to mail it because it's most effective. So he's really, and on Substack, he writes all the time about it. It's really on a silver platter that he's handing us this very, very tangible hammer to use to do what we can to intercede, to make our governments represent us in all these countries. I want to give as a cherry on this thing, just extra pointing out, 400 years ago, the trade was really established by the shipping on the water, and what a threat that trains were. What a need to control the United States, and the effort to break her up into 2 countries then, and to control the development of a country's internal trade so it could be independent, like you well described. And it really helps flesh out, the mile-high view of what the heck is going on right now. I really appreciated that, and this has been a pleasure. Thank you, Joaquin.
Thank you. No, thank you it's great questions too, and feedback. Thank you. Are you Bruce?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Good to meet you.
Likewise.
Joaquin, do you have time for 2 more questions, or do we have to wrap it up?
Yes, I do have time for 2 more. Yeah.
All right, sweet. All right, Monty, go for it.
Yes, thank you both very much, and greetings from Baja, Mexico. Yes, given I'd like to position this question with recent development. Victoria Nuland was just recently ascended to the Assistant Deputy of Secretary of State. You know, I mean, she's crazy. If anything, she's pushing for a neocon agenda and war, engaging NATO in the war. In other words, a Mad Max, Dr. Strangelove kind of a card they're playing with this. And then just yesterday, I think in maybe an effort to quell or distract from that threat, Blinken came out and made the crazy statement that climate change, this new boiling climate, and climate change is the real problem. It's not the threat of nuclear war. I think a lot of nations, I'm not sure who they're trying to direct this message to because it's simply crazy. But in light of that, what I'm also seeing is in Africa with the success of the summit, you're having things like Lumumba's brother coming out and Lumumba's getting resurrected as a hero again. The president of Eritrea coming out and saying all the United States have, they don't have manufacturing, all they can do is print money. And then in West Africa, you have all these uprisings now, like in Niger, where they're waving Russian flags and trying to boot the French out of West Africa. Do you think that Africa's starting to see through this grift a little bit? Because I guess that's my question.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I remember when I was in a university decades ago, I had a international relations professor, and she said at the time that the U.S. had no plans for the development in Africa for at least the next 50 years. But the one thing it was committed to was making sure that no one else would go and develop Africa either. And that's a very big problem. So it's perfectly fine that the U.S. had not a strong interest in investment in developing Africa. But the biggest crime was that it went out of its way to subvert efforts of countries and parts of the world that did want to invest and build in Africa. So I think that there was actually a non-aligned movement, and there was a system that African leaders were also able to exploit in kind of juggling between the U.S. and the Soviets and trying to get the best deals. But for the last number of decades, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, ever since the end of the non-aligned movement, ever since the destruction of Yugoslavia, which was probably, well, it was the non-aligned movement was established in the early 60s in Belgrade. But so even though it would include, Jamaica's Michael Manley and it would involve India and many other, regions and parts of the world, with the destruction of the Soviet Union, a lot of that the non-aligned movement was successful. There wasn't really a military superpower that you could associate with non-aligned movement. There was really a block of countries, and it was more of a concept, and it allowed countries to kind of balance off a powerful Soviet bloc and a powerful Western bloc. So African leaders knew about that for a long time. The problem, brother, is that those options went away, and they didn't come back until recently. And so now there's a new generation. Now Africans are seeing that it's possible. It hadn't been there. They wanted it, and when it existed in the past, they went for it. They totally, and I want to use the word in the most neutral sense, they totally exploited it to their best interest, for their country's interest. They totally exploited the Cold War in a way that worked for them. And without the Cold War, without the Soviets, they only had one agenda. There was only one party that could really get in there. And that was the U.S. and Europe. So they didn't have a lot of options, like you're saying. So yeah, they're definitely, this has come back now. This idea that if you're not happy with them, you've got these guys over here, and that's going to help a lot. But it's not just going to be these guys over here. It's going to be over there in Rio de Janeiro, over here in Shanghai, over there in Moscow. And also, it doesn't eliminate the role of Europe and the United States. It's not about kicking them out. It's going to make them more competitive. It's going to make them more honest, or at least make them give better deals. Cool. And the first thing was, you were talking about I'm trying to remember the first part of the question, but I think that was the substance of the answer.
Yeah, I think that was adequate. I was just referring to the. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Cool. All right, let's round her out with Kelly.
Hey, Joaquin.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. First of all, yeah, you're my main source of news when it comes to Eastern Europe geopolitics. So I just want to say thanks about that.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
And yeah, you did a posting, I guess, earlier today. Putin had a speech. He was talking about Poland and how they probably, bring their forces into Ukraine, or at least like annex part of Ukraine.
That's right. Yeah.
And like Putin, like he's not against that. He's saying like it's none of my business.
Right.
And then I got to thinking, like, other countries will be doing this, like Slovakia, Hungary, because all these are like, they're all like border countries. Even like Poland, they have, like, going back hundreds of years, they have like there's a family relationship like with the Slavs, the East and West and all that.
Right. That's right. Poland's moved around a little bit too. Poland's moved around.
Yeah, it's like it's on the map. It's not on the map. It was like joined with Lithuania there for several years. Which
yeah,
was,
it was a little
I thought
bit
that
further
was
west. It used to be a little bit further west than it is now. Now it's a little bit further east than it was before. And so, and also times it's disappeared completely and come back. So yeah, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting country. Yes.
So I get the impression like Putin, like he understands all this, like the history and that. And, Russia's such a huge country. They have like borders all around. Not much seaports, like not much access to the rest of the world, but they have a lot of landlocked countries, and they must have dealt with it for like centuries, and like with their diplomats, and it reflects off Putin. Like he's like, he allows this. It's like, you could do that. It's none of my business. But just don't cross this line, like Belarus, they're a really close friend of ours, and you don't cross that line. What's my point here? I guess I kind of like really respect what he's doing. And I find it hard to understand like how all these like some of these satellite countries like Poland and well even Ukraine and some of the other ones, like even though they're Slavs, they can't they can't understand where he's coming from. I just find that hard to comprehend. I just wondered if you had any comments on that.
It's like the population in Poland I've seen different figures, and it's hard to place, and there's always different regions of a country, but just on the whole, as many of a third of Polish citizens are actually fairly pro-Russia thematically. Less of them might be pro-Russia right now, but that's distinct from it's distinct in Poland for people that are just against Russia, or people that are against Russia, or people that are just against Putin. And so one of the successes in Poland for NATO has been to foster a political leadership that has built up and increased anti-Russian sentiments. I'm not saying that they're non-existent or unnatural in Poland, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that it gets amplified a lot, and that population, whether it's 15% or 30%, that's more friendly to Russia conceptually or thematically, like they're suppressed and they don't feel like they can say that like in a supermarket or at work or something like that. But if there was different leadership and a different media environment in Poland, then you might see like 50% or 60% of the population be thematically pro-Russian or friendly, to have positive associations with the word Russia. You see what I mean? Ukraine was much more 50-50 or even more pro-Russian than 50-50. And this growth of anti-Russianism in Ukraine is much more recent and yet much more rapid than in Poland. And the thing about the Poles maybe going into Western Ukraine, as you were asking about, is that the main issue is, and I agree with you, it was very interesting that Putin basically said, do what you want there in the West, because Russia has no interest or ability or mandate to rule over Galicians who almost congenitally hate Russia. Like if there's one part of Ukraine where it's not recent, where it does go back, some concept that was put in the minds of people in the mid-late 19th century by German geopolitician, geostrategists that understood that in the future wars against Russia would need this group. It was actually a whole anthropological spelunking adventure that the Germans went on when they were looking at this social anthropology of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which became the Russian Empire, which would then become the Pale of Settlement, where the Jews were forced to live in this area, right? And from Belarus through parts of Ukraine, etc., Poland, and in this area, the Germans really they did extensive studies, very granular studies of ethnicity and concepts and tropes to really kind of, as if you were like a record producer going deep into the inner city to find a new rapper as like a new artist or something like that. They really dug deep into the culture, right? And they came up with this kind of Ukrainian identity. And the Germans have been kind of promoting and expanding on this Galician theme to become a Ukrainian identity. Ukraine doesn't have an identity in and of itself. This is not my idea. This is a fact that Ukrainian ethnologists and educated Ukrainian people have known for a long time. And this kind of whole national hypnosis or national hysteria about a deep-rooted singular Ukrainian identity, they know is hogwash. They know it's a recent invention. So people like Arestovich, for example, who is very pro-Ukrainian, he's like a friend of Zelensky's. He's also an entertainer, also an actor, comedian, but also a military institute graduate, also a geopolitician. And he's an advisor to Zelensky, and he speaks often in Ukrainian media, and he has also said that, scratch a Ukrainian and you get a Russian. He knows that that's the case. He knows that a lot of this Ukrainian concept is like a coat of lacquer painted on Russians to make them different from the other Russians. What's weird about Russia is that it's actually many time zones, like a dozen time zones, and the differences between the different types of Russians throughout the Russian Federation are not more different than the differences between a Western Russian and a Ukrainian. Like Russians from the Rostov region are not different from Ukrainians from Dnipropetrovsk. That's not the border, you see. So it's, I think what Putin has communicated is that Poland clearly has some territorial ambitions, and Poland, Turkey and Russia are both countries that in recent years have either de facto or in actuality expanded the territory of their country. And I think that Duda is seeing a similar opportunity arise, similar to what Erdogan, when he picked off a piece of northern Syria, and they're still there. They've totally changed it. All the flags are Turkish and everything. Other countries don't recognize it, though. And I think that if the Poles go into Western Ukraine, I don't think they're going to make it part of Poland and make, like, not formally. It could be a 10 or 15 or 20-year process without any conclusion. Yeah. You see what I'm saying? So there's not the idea that the Poles going into that part of Ukraine would instantly make that NATO, and instantly then they could deploy missiles there or something. None of that stops Poland from, it doesn't give the real advantage. And for much of the truth is that without access to the Black Sea, in particular the Crimean Peninsula, Ukraine is not worth to NATO to be a member. It's the trade-off and the balance and the risk and the population and the security management and everything only pays off if you get Crimea. If you don't have Crimea, it's like pointless to have. It's more of a liability, especially now that you've pumped up the entire political system full of Russophobes. They've created a bigger problem. They've actually created it to be necessary now that Ukraine can never join NATO, because they'll never get Crimea back, but their government is too unstable. The government's not going to recognize the borders with Russia, the new borders. And you can't really be in a big territorial dispute with a nuclear superpower and join NATO. See, NATO only works as a discouraging, it's supposed to keep you from wanting to attack Russia. It's like you can't buy the insurance after you've been in the accident. You see what I mean? Like trying to get Ukraine into NATO during a conflict violates every single main concept of what the point of an alliance is supposed to be. It's supposed to discourage conflict and be preventative. You can't, entering into an alliance while you're in a war is just those countries joining the war with you. It's not at all, it's the opposite of the concept of what a defensive alliance does. So if it then becomes an offensive alliance, right, then that puts it in that means that, and this is, I found this is actually from a lawyer that is trying to argue the case now. He says that NATO Article 7 explicitly prohibits NATO from being an offensive alliance. If Ukraine has a territorial dispute with Russia as it enters into NATO, it makes NATO into an offensive organization de facto. He makes the case that it's already acting that way. But if they were to get Ukraine in, it would be, there's no alternate case that could be made against that. So then you have this idea of NATO as an offensive organization, and it's taking prerogative to enforce some type of system that is different, because that's what the aggression leads to, some change in the status quo. And those changes in the status quo are only supposed to happen at the level of the UN Security Council. And the reason that NATO Article 7 is there is it specifically defines NATO in such a way so that it's not abrogating the role of the UN Security Council. So the UN Security Council is the final word on these kind of disputes in international law. And the last Security Council resolution on Ukraine is the Minsk Agreement and UN Security Council Resolution 2202. And 2202 was not enforced by the Ukrainians, despite that they were a signatory to it. In fact, they violated it. And Russia, as a guarantor and the one who brought it to the UN Security Council, and all the other countries, including the United States, voted yes. There was no abstention, none of that. This is international law. UN Security Council Resolution 2202. And Ukraine's in violation of that. So it's not a crazy argument to make. And the Russians haven't made this argument themselves, mind you. But and why they haven't is almost more interesting, because the obvious case is the United States violated international law or created new international legalities or redefined lawfulness when it acted on itself without a UN Security Council resolution to enforce a UN Security Council resolution on Iraq. So when Clinton ordered the bombing of Iraq, they were saying it was because they weren't letting Scott Ritter in. Remember, Scott Ritter at the time was saying, hey, Iraq is saying, come and check it out. Iraq is saying, come and look at the facilities. And the Americans are like, no, 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 we've already decided to bomb them. It doesn't matter if they're allowing us in. We just said they're not allowing us in so we could bomb them. The point was to bomb them, not to allow anyone. We don't care. We know they don't have anything. That's why we're bombing them. If they had something, we wouldn't bomb them, in fact. So that was when the U.S. effectively created a new interpretation or novel interpretation of international law, that a member of the UN Security Council can unilaterally act to put into effect something which the whole council had agreed on previously, even though there's no language in the Security Council resolution that says in the event that you don't do it, then the U.S. can go in and and enforce. So so the U.S. actually created the legal argument that Russia could make about why it's in Ukraine. It's enforcing the Minsk resolution. So, but yeah, I don't think that Poland is going to formally take that part of Ukraine into it. It's only going to do everything else. And everything else has actually already begun. In fact, for the past year, there's only been legislation in Ukraine that makes special laws for Polish PMCs, like Polish private military companies, Polish banks, Polish real estate. It basically confers what you would call diplomatic immunity to all these different Polish actors acting on the territory of Ukraine. It gives them all the rights of citizens and none of the liabilities. And that's kind of setting up for a two-tier citizen system where Polish people in Ukraine will be special people above the law. Maybe they'll only operate in the western part of Ukraine. It doesn't make sense for Ukraine and Poland to formally enter into a treaty that hands over that territory. In fact, that ambiguity where you have a NATO power acting in territory that's not NATO, but as a buffer against Russia. There's a logic to this, and it looks like my interpretation, and people have agreed that Putin left this open to interpretation, but my interpretation is that he'd be okay with that, with Poland assuming the responsibility over that part of Ukraine. Now, my final words on that to you, in fact, are even more, the funnier part, or what's very interesting about this from Russia's perspective is that Poland's government's very nationalistic, and they're very, very clear about who Bandera is. It's not like, oh, we all nationalists get along. Like, we're the nationalists against your nationalists. Like, our nationalism was built, our narrative, our nationalism views your nationalism as genocidal to our people. So Polish nationalism views Galician nationalism, not Ukrainian, but Galician, the western parts of Ukraine are Galicia. They view this Galician Nazism as, an insult to their historical memory. For them to be going back into Galicia would be to reverse, the whole concept of Bandera, would be to reverse the whole Galician concept. Like, Galicia is formed as a Hitler puppet state as a commitment to genocide the Poles that were there. So for the Poles themselves, very nationalistic Poles too, to be coming back to Galicia is nothing like old friends getting back together. It's nothing like I got your back. It's nothing like that. This is almost like some other type of occupation. So a year and a half ago, I even put forward, hey, hypothetically, it's possible that Putin and Duda can agree to this behind, through back channels. Like, this could be friendly to Russia for Poland to basically take this orphan region of Ukraine. So that would be my final thought on that. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I'm actually gonna make that little mini composition a standalone video into itself. There's a lot of high value in there. That's good. That's good.
Fantastic.
Joaquin, and that's sort of been the case. Every little question has like almost like a standalone lecture that you can just unpack. And this is really more than a masterclass. I really do appreciate you having painted this brushstroke with a lot of great refined detail on core points that people can now think about and apply to their own analysis. I'm looking forward to future things. I have a lot of questions as well that piled up, but I know we ran out of time, so I'm looking forward to maybe scheduling an interview with you maybe next week or something like that, and I can pick your brain a little bit more, especially on the Rumsfeld plans for New Europe and that whole thing that you were just alluding to.
You lost connection a few times, and yeah, I know but fortunately none of us, thank God, has a mortal illness. We expect to be around a few weeks from now. We can get back together and do something.
Amen. All right, let's make that happen. So everybody, thank you so much for coming on today. We have more lectures planned in the coming Sundays ahead. Something on ancient India is coming up next Sunday, which should blow a lot of people's minds and make some connections to Europe in ways that would make British imperialists really pissed off. So that'll be a fun one. And then we got some more stuff coming up on geopolitics after that. So Joaquin, once again, for anybody who wants to go to your channel, I highly recommend, as Kelly does every morning, check out t.me/new resistance. The link will be in the description box, and we'll go from there. So thank you, Joaquin.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me. My pleasure.